They sold her as freedom. The FBI treated her like a threat. To the public, Jean Seberg was the cool American face of the French New Wave. Off-screen, her politics put her in a federal file. The FBI placed her under scrutiny, then used her public image against her. A false pregnancy rumor reached the press. Her name was turned from star into warning. Did Paris deliver the final answer, or just the version that made the harder questions easier to ignore? But when a woman has already been watched, smeared, and broken in public, who benefits when the case closes that quickly? You're watching Hollywood Dark Secrets, where the official ending is never the whole story. Jean Seberg did not enter Hollywood through the usual side door. She did not spend years playing waitresses, secretaries, girlfriends, and nameless pretty faces until someone finally remembered her name. She came in through a national spectacle. Otto Preminger wanted a new face for St. Joan, and the search itself became part of the product. Newspapers followed it. Magazines followed it. Thousands of ordinary girls were told that one of them could be lifted from obscurity and placed in front of the world. The number attached to the legend was enormous: 18,000 applicants. Out of that crowd, Preminger chose a teenager from Marshalltown, Iowa. The story sounded clean. It sounded democratic. It sounded like Hollywood opening a door. That was the version sold to the public. Inside the business, the door had a lock on it. Jean was young enough to believe that being chosen meant being protected. She came from Iowa with a face that looked untouched by the machinery. That was exactly what made her useful. Preminger did not want a trained actress with strong habits, hard opinions, and a clear sense of her own value. He wanted someone new enough to shape. The search made Jean look like a miracle. The contract made her feel less like a young actress and more like a controlled investment. Once the papers were signed, the warm language disappeared. The smiles became instructions. The excitement became pressure. She was no longer just a girl who had won a role. She was the center of an expensive public bet, and everyone around her expected her to carry it without breaking. St. Joan was supposed to turn her into a serious star. Instead, it showed her how quickly a studio dream could become physical danger. During the burning at the stake scene, the production used real fire. Accounts of the incident vary in detail, but the core fact remains. The fire got out of control, and Jean was burned while filming. She was tied into the scene, dressed as a saint, surrounded by a crew, lights, props, and cameras. There is no clean way to soften that image. A teenage actress, chosen because she looked pure enough to play martyrdom, was hurt while the production tried to turn that image into a movie. The public later heard the polished version. Film accidents happen. Sets are difficult. Directors are demanding. Art requires sacrifice. Those phrases always sound neat when spoken by people who were not the ones standing in the heat. Jean carried the mark. The injury became more than a production story because it fit too perfectly with the rest of her life. She had been introduced as a saint, exposed as a target, and then punished by critics who treated her youth and inexperience like personal failure. She later summed it up in a line that stayed with her story. She had been burned at the stake on film and then burned by the critics. That line worked because it was not clever. It was plain. It was what happened. Preminger's film did not deliver the triumph Hollywood promised. St. Joan was attacked, and Jean absorbed much of the blame. The people who had sold her as a discovery did not step forward to explain how little training she had been given, how heavy the part was, or how cruel the publicity machine could be when its miracle did not perform exactly as advertised. The same system that made her famous overnight now treated her as if she had personally failed an empire. That may have been one of her first lessons in image control. Hollywood could build a person up in public, then leave that same person alone when the public turned. Her next film with Preminger, Bonjour Tristesse, gave her something closer to the screen identity that would follow her. Cool, watchful, emotionally unreadable. She did not look like the older studio stars, polished until every movement felt approved. Jean looked modern. She looked unfinished in a way the camera liked. She could stand still and seem as if she had already left the room. American Hollywood did not fully know what to do with that. Europe did. In Paris, Jean became something different. Not safer, but different. Breathless changed the way the world saw her. Jean-Luc Godard did not frame her like a studio possession. He let the streets press in around her. He let her walk, talk, sell newspapers, smoke, hesitate, flirt, retreat, and stare into space as if the movie had caught her before she had decided who she was going to be. As Patricia Franchini, Jean looked casual enough to be real and distant enough to become an icon. Her short hair became a signal. Her sweaters became a uniform. Her face, printed in stills and posters, became shorthand for a new kind of woman. Young, sharp, unbothered, hard to own. That was the public fantasy. The woman who could not be owned. But the real Jean had already learned what ownership felt like. She had seen it in contracts, publicity tours, film sets, and reviews that treated her body and choices as common property. Paris did not erase that. It only gave the public a better mask to project onto her. The French New Wave made her look free. Freedom became her brand. Men wrote about her as if she were an idea. Photographers captured the haircut, the cigarette, the narrow shirt, the direct gaze. Young women copied the look. Critics praised the presence. But presence is not protection. Style is not a home. A person can become a symbol and still have nowhere safe to stand. That split is the first real wound in the Jean Seberg story. The audience looked at her and saw independence. The government looked at her and saw influence. The press looked at her and saw copy. Some men around her seemed to see access before they saw the person. Very few people seemed able to look at her and see a young woman trying to make sense of the power she'd been given and the damage that came with it. Jean's politics did not appear from nowhere. They were not invented by Paris, fame, or the fashion of radical circles. Long before she became a European screen image, she had shown interest in civil rights. Accounts describe her joining the NAACP as a teenager in Iowa, a choice that was not harmless in the social climate of the time. This matters because it cuts through the easiest accusation later made against her, that she was a bored actress playing at rebellion. That version is too convenient. It lets the powerful dismiss conscience as performance. Jean's concern for racial justice began before it was useful to her image. In Hollywood terms, it was the wrong kind of sincerity. It could not be neatly packaged without risk. By the late 1960s, risk was exactly what the country was trained to see. The United States was angry, divided, and suspicious. Civil rights leaders had been watched. Anti-war activists had been watched. Black political organizations were treated not only as protest movements, but as threats to be contained. The Black Panther Party became one of the main targets of federal attention. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI saw the group through the lens of national security, and COINTELPRO gave that suspicion a hidden set of tools. The stated language was about disruption. The lived effect was fear. Informants, pressure, planted stories, forged letters, surveillance, and reputation damage became methods of control. Jean stepped into that world with money, fame, and a belief that a public platform should be used for more than photographs. She gave support. She gave funds. Reports and FBI material connected her with donations to Black Panther programs, including community work such as food programs. The amount often cited is $10,500. In the hands of a studio publicist, that could have been softened into charity. In the eyes of Hoover's bureau, it looked different. It was not just that she had money. It was that she was a white international movie star using that money to support people the government wanted isolated. Her fame gave legitimacy. Her presence attracted attention. Her checks could become meals, offices, travel, legal help, or proof that the Panthers were not as alone as officials wanted them to seem. A famous woman writing a check can look small on paper. Inside a paranoid institution, it can look like a breach. The FBI did not need to fully understand Jean to decide she was useful as a target. It understood enough. She was visible. She was sympathetic. She moved between America and Europe. She could speak to reporters. She had friends in political circles. She was not locked inside the old studio system in the same way actresses had been a generation earlier. That made her harder to discipline through the normal Hollywood channels. If the studio could not fully control the star, another machine could try to control the story around her. That is where her case becomes larger than celebrity scandal. Jean Seberg was not simply watched because she was famous. Her fame made the watching more useful. If a private citizen gave money, the file stayed small. If Jean Seberg gave money, the file had public value. Destroying her reputation could send a message. It could tell other public figures that sympathy had a price. It could tell activists that support could be turned into scandal. It could tell women in particular that their bodies, marriages, pregnancies, and private lives could be dragged into politics whenever the state needed a softer weapon. The FBI did not have to argue with her beliefs. It could attack her image. Jean's danger was not that she held a weapon. Her danger was that she held attention. In the late 1960s, attention was already a political resource. A speech could be ignored if it came from a poor neighborhood. A donation could be buried if it came from an unknown name. But when a famous actress crossed the same line, reporters noticed. Photographers noticed. Young people noticed. The same face that had sold tickets could also make a political cause look human to people who had been trained to fear it. That was what made her useful to activists and dangerous to officials. She could soften the distance between a frightened middle-class audience and a movement the government wanted painted as untouchable. The Bureau understood image better than it admitted. It knew that Jean did not have to write policy or lead marches to matter. Her presence alone could disturb the official story. If she sat in a room with black activists, the room looked different. If she wrote a check, the check carried more than money. If she allowed her name to be connected to civil rights work, the cause borrowed part of her visibility. That visibility could not be allowed to spread without a cost. The warning had to be personal enough for other famous people to understand it. It had to say, if you use your fame this way, your fame can be turned against you. That is why gossip was so useful. A political attack might have made Jean look brave to some people. A courtroom fight might have made the government look heavy-handed. A public accusation might have forced officials to show evidence. Gossip avoided all of that. Gossip does not need to prove itself before it starts working. It only needs to enter conversation. Once it does, the target has to fight smoke with bare hands. Every denial sounds defensive. Every silence sounds guilty. Every correction arrives late. The lie becomes part of the person's public texture, even after it is exposed. Jean was especially vulnerable because her image was built on contradiction. She looked independent, but she was emotionally exposed. She looked modern, but the culture judging her was still deeply conservative. She had become famous in Europe, but American media still treated her through old rules about women, sex, race, and respectability. She was allowed to look rebellious on screen because rebellion could be sold as style. But real political rebellion was different. Real rebellion had names, addresses, donations, meetings, and consequences. The moment Jean's conscience became practical, the tolerance around her changed. The old studio system might once have tried to hide the problem. It might have assigned a publicist, arranged a controlled interview, sent flowers to a columnist, or traded one story to bury another. But Jean was no longer fully contained by that system. She moved between countries. She worked with European directors. She had a public identity that did not depend only on American studio approval. That gave her room, but it also left her exposed. There was no single studio boss whose investment required protecting her. No studio machine stood between her and the federal file. No fixer came in at midnight to make the story disappear. When the pressure arrived, she faced it with fame, money, and nerves that had already been worn thin. The FBI did not have to invent the public's prejudices. It only had to aim them. That is the ugliest part of the operation. The rumor worked because officials understood exactly which fears were already sitting inside the culture. A white actress, a black political organization, a pregnancy, a marriage under strain, a public that still treated women's bodies as evidence in a moral trial. The Bureau did not create those conditions. It used them. It pushed one false story into a country already prepared to believe the worst if the scandal was packaged correctly. And the press gave that package a respectable shape. A blind item looks playful on the page. It gives the reader the pleasure of guessing. It lets the writer avoid the responsibility of direct accusation. But inside Hollywood, a blind item is not harmless. It is a warning shot. It tells everyone close to the target that someone knows something or claims to know something and is willing to print more. For Jean, the blind item was worse because it came with invisible government weight behind it. The column looked like gossip. The source was power. That is how the trap was set before the pregnancy story broke into the open. Jean was already under observation. Her politics had already been framed as danger. Her friends and donations had already been translated into suspicion. Her public image had already become something the Bureau wanted to damage. By the time the false rumor reached the newspapers, the system did not need to build a case against her. It only needed to release the right poison into the right channel and let the culture do the rest. By 1970, Jean was pregnant. The facts around the pregnancy were known to some people close to her. Romain Gary, her husband, was aware of the situation and was prepared to protect the child publicly. The biological father has widely been identified in accounts as Carlos Navarra, a young activist. That private complexity was painful enough. A marriage, a pregnancy, public attention, political pressure, and emotional strain were already pressing against her life. The FBI saw something else. It saw an opening. Declassified records later showed the Bureau's intention with brutal clarity. Agents wanted to publicize a rumor that the father of Jean's child was a Black Panther. The point was not truth. The point was damage. They understood the racism of the audience they were feeding. They understood what a rumor like that could do to a white actress whose public image still depended, in part, on old moral codes. They understood that pregnancy gave the story a physical hook. This was not just gossip. It was a designed pressure campaign. The method was simple because the press made it simple. The Bureau did not need to hold a press conference. It did not need to put an agent's name on the story. It could pass the rumor into the gossip system and let newspapers do the dirty work with clean hands. Joyce Haber of the Los Angeles Times ran a blind item. Newsweek later printed the story and identified Jean. Once her name appeared, the private lie became public material. It moved from column to conversation, from conversation to judgment, from judgment to harm. That is how reputation damage works when powerful institutions know where to place the first match. The Bureau helped create and circulate the rumor. The press gives it shape. The public gives it oxygen. By the time the target tries to answer, the lie has already moved faster than the correction ever can. Jean was not dealing with ordinary embarrassment. She was pregnant while being watched, discussed, and racially smeared in public. The story was designed to make her feel exposed at the most vulnerable point of her life. It pulled together every pressure line around her: sex, politics, race, marriage, motherhood, and fame. A rumor that might have been printed in a few careless sentences became something her body had to carry. In August of 1970, Jean gave birth prematurely to a daughter, Nina Hart Gary. The baby lived only 2 days. The medical facts should be handled carefully. A responsible telling cannot pretend to hold a doctor's certainty from decades away. What can be said is that Jean and people close to her believed the FBI smear, and the public pressure around it contributed to the crisis. Romain Gary later blamed the campaign for the trauma surrounding the pregnancy. The emotional truth does not require exaggeration. Jean had been targeted while pregnant. Her baby was born too early. The child died. Those facts are heavy enough without forcing them into a false courtroom certainty. Then came the funeral. Accounts describe Jean allowing the press to see the child, in part to confront the lie that had been printed about the baby's father. Some tellings refer to a glass-covered casket. However the physical details are described, the meaning was clear. Jean had been forced into a position no mother should ever have to occupy. She had to answer a government-fed racial rumor at the burial of her own child. She had to turn grief into evidence. She had to make the press look at what its carelessness had helped create. That is one of the hardest emotional points in the entire story. Not because it is loud, because it is so plain. A woman should not have to use her child's funeral as a correction notice. She should not have to prove anything to reporters standing nearby with cameras. She should not have to defend her dignity while standing beside the smallest coffin a parent can imagine. But the system had pushed her there. It had made denial inadequate. It had made silence impossible. It had made private mourning public work. After that, Jean's life did not simply resume. It narrowed. The public often likes to think scandal ends when the newspaper cycle moves on. For the person inside it, the body keeps the calendar. Each year, the dates return. August returned. The memory returned. The loss returned. Jean's mental health suffered badly in the years after Nina's death. Accounts describe depression, fear, dependence on medication and alcohol, and repeated crises around the anniversary of the baby's passing. It is easy, from a distance, to turn that into another tragic celebrity detail. It was not a detail. It was daily life. It was the phone ringing and not knowing who was on the line. It was a stranger on the street who might be just a stranger or might not. It was a headline remembered at the wrong hour. It was a room in Paris where fame could not keep the walls from closing in. The FBI file did not sit quietly in the past for her. It followed her through the way she understood the world. A file is not a life, but it can change one. Jean kept working, but the old electricity became harder to sustain. She had always had a fragile quality on screen, but fragility is different when the audience begins to suspect it is not performance. Her later roles did not carry the same clean promise as Breathless. The industry had moved. The French New Wave had become history while she was still alive. Younger faces arrived. Producers became cautious. Insurance, reliability, reputation, and money all entered the room before she did. That is how a star becomes a problem without anyone making a formal announcement. The calls become fewer. The offers become thinner. The silence becomes professional. Meanwhile, the people around Jean did not always protect her. Her relationships were complicated, and some of the men in her life seemed better at using her image than caring for the person underneath it. Romain Gary defended her publicly around the pregnancy smear, but their marriage had its own fractures. Other relationships carried instability, dependence, and accusation. In the final period of her life, she became involved with Ahmed Hasni, a much younger man. Accounts of that relationship describe control, conflict, and financial exploitation, though details vary and should not be treated as clean courtroom fact. What matters for the story is the pattern. Jean was isolated, emotionally exhausted, and surrounded by people who did not always reduce the danger around her. Isolation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is administrative. Missed appointments, unanswered calls, rent, accounts, contracts, prescriptions, keys, letters, hotel rooms, parked cars, old friends who no longer know what to say. Jean's life, once spread across magazines and movie screens, seemed to shrink into a set of private emergencies. She had been a face of modern freedom, but by the end, she was fighting to maintain basic control over her days. On August 30th, 1979, Jean Seberg disappeared in Paris. She was 40 years old. Her body was found days later in the back of a parked Renault. The official ruling pointed to a probable self-inflicted overdose involving barbiturates and alcohol. A note was reportedly found. That is the official frame. It is also the point where harder questions begin. Not because every official conclusion is automatically false, not because every tragedy must be turned into a conspiracy. The harder question is about responsibility. When a person has been watched by the state, smeared through the press, destabilized for years, and left to carry a grief that began in a government file, how clean can any ending really be? The file does not need to hold the final pill to be part of the final story. After Jean was gone, the paper trail began to speak louder. COINTELPRO had already been exposed as a program built to surveil, disrupt, and discredit political targets. In 1979, reports revealed that the FBI had approved a smear campaign against Jean Seberg over her pregnancy. The admission came too late to repair anything. It did not bring Nina back. It did not return Jean's peace. It did not put the lie back inside the drawer where it had been typed. It only showed the public that the thing she had feared was not fantasy. There had been a file, and behind it, there had been a plan. There had been an FBI-backed attempt to damage her name. Think about what that does to the record of a life. For years, a woman could be called paranoid, unstable, dramatic, too sensitive, too political, too emotional. Then the file opens after she is gone, and the language changes. What sounded like fear begins to look like evidence. What sounded like instability begins to look like a response to pressure. That is the mistake many people make with Jean Seberg. They look for one villain, one night, one decision, one document, one parked car. Her life does not reduce that easily. The damage was layered. Preminger's Hollywood taught her that image could be built over pain. The critics taught her that a young woman could be publicly punished for not fulfilling the fantasy built around her. The French New Wave made her immortal, but also made her into a surface people could use. The FBI turned her politics into a target. The press turned a false rumor into a national wound. The death of her child broke something that fame could not repair. The government's later admission confirmed the machinery behind the fear. The final years exposed how little protection remained once the icon no longer served the market. That is not one event. That is a system. Romain Gary understood part of that system, even if he was also part of Jean's painful orbit. After her death, he spoke publicly about the FBI's role in destroying her. He did not let the Bureau's admission sit as a footnote. He connected it to the living damage done to her. In December of 1980, Gary also died in Paris. His note reportedly insisted that his death had nothing to do with Jean Seberg. That sentence has followed the story because it feels almost too controlled. Even at the end, he wanted the narrative managed. That was Gary's instinct. Language, framing, authorship. Jean had spent much of her life trying to escape other people's framing. Even in death, the frames kept coming. Hollywood likes clean endings. So does government. So does the press. Clean endings are useful. They let everyone place blame on a single personal weakness and walk away. Jean was troubled. Jean was fragile. Jean made bad choices. Jean fell apart. Those statements may contain pieces of truth, but used alone, they become a cover. They move attention away from the people and institutions that applied pressure before the collapse, The FBI did not create Jean Seberg's every wound. That would be too simple. But it knowingly opened one of the deepest. It took a pregnant woman and turned her into a political example. It used racism as a delivery system. It used gossip as a weapon. It used the press because the press was willing to be used. Then, when the truth surfaced, the language became bureaucratic. Mistakes were acknowledged. Context was cited. The past was blamed. Nobody handed Jean back the years. That is the most important lesson in her case. State power does not always arrive with a uniform at the door. Sometimes it arrives as a blind item. Sometimes it hides in a gossip column. Sometimes it speaks through a magazine editor who never asks who benefits from the story. Sometimes it turns public curiosity into pressure so efficiently that the audience does not notice it has been recruited. Jean's case forces the viewer to ask an uncomfortable question. When a lie reaches millions of people, who actually told it? The agent who typed it? The official who approved it? The columnist who printed it? The editor who failed to verify it? The reader who enjoyed it? The answer is not clean. That is why the machine works. Responsibility gets spread thin until no single hand looks dirty enough. The emotional power of Jean Seberg's story is not only that she suffered. Many stars suffered. The power is that she saw suffering outside herself and tried to respond. She could have stayed inside the safer version of fame. She could have smiled, posed, promoted films, and kept her politics vague. That would have been easier. That would have been more profitable. Instead, she used her money and visibility for people the government had already marked as dangerous. She did not always understand the risks. She may have been naive about some of the people around her. She may have trusted too quickly. But naivety is not a crime. Compassion is not a scandal. The scandal is what happened to her because of it. The government did not need a new weapon. It used reputation. And reputation is a perfect weapon against a woman in public. It is cheap. It travels fast. It does not need proof at the start because proof is always demanded too late. It makes the target spend energy denying instead of living. It turns friends cautious. It makes employers nervous. It makes strangers feel entitled to judge. For a woman whose face had been sold as cool, clean, and modern, the smear was designed to contaminate every image at once. There is a reason the pregnancy rumor was chosen. It touched race, sex, motherhood, marriage, and politics in one strike. It was built to offend the most conservative readers and excite the most careless ones. It was not only an attack on Jean's beliefs. It was an attack on her body as public property. That is what makes the story feel current, even now. The tools have changed, but the pattern remains familiar. A woman speaks, supports, refuses, or steps outside the expected line. Then the story moves from what she said to who she slept with, what kind of mother she is, whether she is unstable, whether she is lying, whether she deserves what comes next. Jean Seberg lived inside that pattern before the internet made it faster. The old image of her in Breathless still circulates. Short hair, striped shirt, newspaper in hand, moving through Paris with a face that looks almost careless. It is a beautiful image, but it can also trap her. If the public remembers only the icon, it misses the cost. That woman on the boulevard was not made of paper. She had scars, she had politics, she had fear. She had a child whose life was pulled into a public lie before it had properly begun. She had a government file with her name on it. She had rooms where the phone did not feel like an object anymore. It felt like a threat. A star image can survive anything because it is not alive. The person underneath cannot. That is why the final question is not simply what happened in Paris. The better question is what had already happened before Paris. What does a public smear do to a nervous system over years? What does surveillance do to trust? What does a government admission do when it arrives after the body has already learned fear? What does the press owe to a person after printing a lie that cannot be untold? What does an audience owe when it has been invited to watch private damage as entertainment? Jean's life sits at the crossing point of Hollywood, politics, media, and gender. Each force touched her. Each force took something. Hollywood took the young girl from Iowa and sold her as a discovery. European cinema took the wounded actress and turned her into a symbol. The FBI treated the politically active woman as a target. The press took the target and made her a headline. The public took the headline and made it judgment. By the end, Jean was left trying to live inside the wreckage of stories other people had written for her. That is why official ending is never enough here. An official ending tells you where a body was found. It does not tell you how many times a person was cornered before that. It tells you what substances were in the system. It does not measure years of pressure. It tells you there was a note. It does not read all the documents that came before it. Jean Seberg's story requires more than a final report because the harm against her was not confined to a final day. It was built slowly by people who understood the usefulness of public shame. The most chilling part is that some of the men who harmed her probably never thought of themselves as cruel. The agents may have thought they were protecting the country. The editors may have thought they were chasing a story. The gossip columnist may have thought she was doing what gossip columnists did. The readers may have thought they were only consuming scandal. That is how damage becomes ordinary. Everyone performs a role. Everyone keeps a little distance from the result. Then one day, a woman is gone, and the same people ask how it could have happened. Jean Seberg's answer was already in the paper trail. She was not destroyed by one rumor alone. She was not destroyed by one man alone. She was not destroyed by one failed film, one political choice, one relationship, one night in Paris. She was worn down by a chain of permissions. A director permitted cruelty in the name of art. Critics permitted humiliation in the name of taste. The FBI permitted a lie in the name of national security. The press permitted publication in the name of access and attention. The public permitted judgment in the name of curiosity. Permission after permission after permission. That is how a machine moves without needing to announce itself. And still, reducing Jean to victimhood would be another kind of theft. She was not only what was done to her. She was talented, restless, political, stubborn, vulnerable, and often difficult to simplify. She made choices that were brave and choices that were messy. She gave money when others gave statements. She crossed lines that safer stars avoided. She brought American sharpness into French cinema and helped define a screen language that still feels modern. She made a haircut look like defiance because the face beneath it seemed to know more than it said. She mattered before the FBI file. She mattered after it. That is what the file could never understand. It could record names, addresses, donations, rumors, associations, and plans to discredit. It could not record the full person. Institutions are good at reducing people to threat categories. Hollywood is good at reducing them to market categories. The press is good at reducing them to headline categories. Jean Seberg kept slipping out of those categories, and each system punished her in its own way. So when people ask whether Paris delivered the final answer, the honest response is this: Paris delivered the official ending. It did not deliver the whole truth. The truth sits in the distance between the girl in Iowa and the woman in the Renault. It begins with the national talent search that looked like opportunity and worked like possession. It continues through the fire on the St. Joan set, the reviews that followed, the Paris streets where she became an icon, and the federal file that grew from one political check. It is in the anonymous rumor passed into a gossip column. It is in the Newsweek pages that turned private pain into public spectacle. It is in the small funeral where a mother had to confront a lie with the most painful proof imaginable. It is in the Bureau's admission, too late to heal what had been broken. It is in every clean sentence that tried to make a dirty campaign sound like procedure. Hollywood sold Jean Seberg as freedom because freedom looked good on camera. The FBI treated her like a threat because freedom, when connected to politics and money, can scare powerful men. The press treated her like a story because stories sell even when they come from poisoned sources. The public treated her like a symbol because symbols are easier to consume than people. But Jean Seberg was a person. That is the detail the machine kept missing. Before this case closes, look again at the central image. Not the famous breathless still. Not the pixie haircut. Not the cigarette. Look instead at a woman standing at the edge of a child's funeral, facing cameras that should never have been there. That is where the glamour falls away. That is where the political file becomes flesh and grief. That is where the false rumor stops being an abstract abuse of power and becomes something a mother has to carry in public. The system wanted her name to become a warning. In a way, it did. But not the warning the FBI intended. Jean Seberg's name warns us what can happen when government power, media hunger, and celebrity culture meet around one vulnerable human being. It warns us that gossip is not harmless when it carries the weight of institutions behind it. It warns us that a lie can keep moving long after it has been exposed. It warns us that official admissions are not justice when they arrive after the damage is complete. The machine did not need to erase Jean Seberg from film history. It could not. Her face was already too deeply printed into cinema. But it damaged the woman behind the image, then stepped back and let the final years look personal. That is the oldest trick in the book. Apply pressure publicly. Describe the collapse privately. Call the result tragedy. Move on. We do not move on that easily. The record shows Jean Seberg was targeted. It shows the FBI planted a false rumor to discredit her. It shows the press carried it. The record suggests her life was never the same after the smear. Everything beyond that must be handled carefully, but careful does not mean soft. The facts are sharp enough. A government agency used a pregnant actress's private life as a weapon. A major publication helped spread the damage. A child was lost. A woman carried years of pressure that never fully left her. The people who built the campaign were not punished in any meaningful way. That is not just a Hollywood tragedy. That is a case file on power. Subscribe to Hollywood Dark Secrets, because the next time a star is called unstable, difficult, dangerous, or broken, the first question should never be what is wrong with her. The first question should be, who needed the public to see her that way?